Today's conversation is going to focus on AI and privacy and the ethical implications around AI. Elizabeth, Frank, Meredith, and I started to have a little bit of the privacy conversation the other day, but we were already hitting up against that 3 hours. And so we knew that we wanted you guys involved in the conversation. And then Megan, we just felt like it would be a complete waste to dive into the ethics, considering that you've been researching it for like a month and a half now and not have you as part of that conversation. So, Elizabeth, you want to get us started?
Sure. We can just dive right in and sort of round robin. What are folks' thoughts about privacy and ethics? I feel like every day there's a new article and a new somebody saying something about, how wonderful AI is, but deep privacy concerns. I've heard people say, we need to reconceptualize how we think about privacy in a digital era. It's not the same. And then you have people say, but what about, the ethics behind all this? So I think it is a complex conversation, and hopefully with all of the viewpoints that are represented on this call, we will be able to sort of dig into that. So I'll just open it up to the floor. What are your thoughts on privacy? We'll start with the privacy conversation. What are your thoughts on the intersections of artificial intelligence, not just generative AI, but AI in general, and privacy?
So I think one of the things that struck me recently was reading that Adobe has been added to the list of corporations that will not allow generative AI in their workplace unless it's their own generative AI. And so when I was reading the article in the New York Times, it basically says that Adobe was citing that they don't want to lose like their corporate information. And that made me really think about like, what are we putting into AI to generate information? And so, I have not jumped full feet into a total AI existence, so I still feel fairly confident and assured, but it made me think like, we've got to have this conversation with students about what they're telling whatever generative AI they're using, because that information is being put into a computer that will store it and use it again later. And so I think that's a really important piece of information, not only for us as we're thinking through how we're using it and how it could be used in the classroom, but also what are we talking to students about privacy in general?
Oh, absolutely. They are not thinking, and they haven't been thinking about what they put out there in the world. And it's funny because I feel like we had these conversations 15 years ago about, be careful what you put on the internet because somebody will find it, whether you've got it behind a login wall or not. All it takes is one person downloading a photograph from your Facebook and posting it somewhere else. And I'm a big true crime person, and I'm very, very fascinated by internet-based crime. So cyberbullying, cyberstalking, and that type of thing. And the number of cases where people have been catfished by other people using photographs of their friends, like, my account got hacked, so I've got a new account now, and they've downloaded all the pictures so it looks legit, and then they get catfished, and they get catfished out of their own accounts. They get catfished into having their money stolen, and in worst case scenarios, you've got people who are losing their lives because they wound up on the wrong end of a dating profile with somebody who has got nefarious purposes. And it's not just about preserving a professional image, it's also about preserving your safety. And a lot of people will say, well, we give a lot of our data away anyway. Anytime you sign up for a new account, you're giving your data away. And I recently learned that phones will ping each other. And so like if you have been talking to somebody and your phones have been in proximity, your phones will pick up on the other person's interests. And you could have been talking to your best friend about something, but your partner's phone will start seeing ads on Facebook for that exact same thing because of the amount of time that your phones spend together. So I don't, on the one hand, we give away a lot of information, and I think that's very true. It's the exchange that we make for convenience. It's the exchange that we make for seamless experiences. Good Lord, do I love being able to just log straight into things on Chrome and not having to remember, even though I have a password wallet where I keep everything, I do like not having to think about it. But on the other hand, we need to think about the things that we're saying to AI and that we're saying to people through those things. You know, it seems really innocuous to say, oh, I'm going away for a week on a vacation. People pay attention. And then your house gets broken into. And that has nothing to do with like cybersecurity in the traditional sense, with, you know, responsible use of your passwords and responsible storage of your passwords. That is, you said you were going away for a week and you posted it out there in the world. And because you didn't lock down your privacy settings on your social media, now somebody's broken into your house and they've stolen all of your stuff. And that has to do with how you've interacted and how you've behaved in the virtual setting. So the fact that that still happens, yes, we need to be having these conversations with students, with our colleagues about how we behave in these environments. And a lot of people would say you can't live scared, and I would agree with that. But you have to live smart, because once you put it out there, even if you've done it with your due diligence, data breaches happen. And we've seen one happen with a third-party vendor that uses or that contracts with the Louisiana Office of Motor Vehicles. We've seen that happen. And I use an iPhone and it will tell me, oh, you might want to change these passwords. There have been data breaches associated with these logins. When we see that, we need to respond to it, because no matter what our due diligence is, people are still clever. Phishing still works. Social engineering still works. And I think it's a bold new world through the lens of AI for a lot of people. And you're going to hear me say this a lot in the AI conversation. Our values don't have to change. Our values are not being substantively changed by AI. We are changing them in response to it. Not that the AI is changing it, because I don't think that's part of what it does. It's how our behaviors are responding to that, and how we need to remember, well, our safety still matters. Our security still matters. We still need to be thinking smartly and not be blinded by the brave new world.
I think it's interesting that you bring up things like catfishing and those sorts of things, because one of the things that AI is going to make it easier for people to do increasingly, it isn't just that they would have to have access to a profile to have your pictures. If you have inputted pictures into some sort of data set that is usable in some sort of a way, it could form an image of you doing something, an image of you holding today's newspaper saying like, yeah, this is me, I'm here. It could use your voice. I was just reading an article recently about warning people to be aware that there are all kinds of AIs now that can mimic a loved one's voice. Grandma, I need $40 majillion because I'm stuck in Abu Dhabi. Like, whatever the thing is. And if it sounds like me, and then it has a picture of me like stuck in Abu Dhabi, love ya, like whatever it is, that's how is it that we're going to be able to tell what kind of skills can we be teaching, again, bringing that back to the education part of this, in terms of digital literacy, artificial intelligence literacy? What is it that we can be teaching our students to look for, to think about when they are putting out information and using these tools? Because also we're going to have students who wind up thinking like, yeah, I can do that, right? Maybe not like get all that money, but use it for something. The ease of access is there. And for as much as, you know, you are saying it doesn't have to change our values, and it doesn't, there is a certain ease of access that makes like a slide easier, right? If I'm going down treacherous stairs, maybe that's difficult for me. If there's like a fun inflatable slide, I'm just like, wee. And that's it seems fun. It seems like a cool thing to maybe do. And I think, that's a similar idea on like the plagiarism conversation that we wind up that happens with AI, that ease of access and that line of where is this you creating something and learning this media, and where is this you doing something harmful? Where are those pieces? And I do also wonder, just like in the privacy thing in general, I do wonder whether the concept of what is private and what is valuable to be private changes. And I think some things we're going to agree are valuable to be private, right? Like your bank information is probably valuable to be private in just about every scenario. But maybe things like, I don't know, certain information about you, certain types of photographs, maybe at some point we reach a generation where everyone has that, or deep fakes are so pervasive that it just doesn't matter.
Related to the privacy thing is intellectual property. Mm-hmm. And that is that when you create something and you post it on the web, copyright law in the United States says that when you've created something original in this country, it is afforded some very basic copyright protection. Now, if you want that to stand up in court, or you'd like to commercialize that, you're going to have to file for full copyright. Totally understandable. But there are a lot of content creators out there who are concerned about what they're putting on the internet being co-opted by AI. So they're out here creating digital art, they're creating fan fiction, and they're creating this really substantive material, and they are now feeling threatened by that being potentially co-opted by AI. Users of Archive Our Own, which is a fanfic forum, are now recommending that everybody put their material behind a login, that they don't make it publicly available so that it cannot be easily farmed by AI, so that it can't be easily farmed by ChatGPT, and a lot of digital creators who create a lot of digital art, and I follow a lot of those, are now putting almost excessive watermarks on the stuff that they publish publicly to connect with their fans. But if you really want to see the unwatermarked, or if you really want to see the full work, you have to log into their Patreon. And I don't think that's just a question of them trying to create a sustainable career from their art, which I'm glad that they can do that. But on the other hand, the fact that they feel that they have to go above and beyond to protect their intellectual property and their privacy as creators, I think says something about our rush into the brave new world again. I hate to keep using that, but I just keep thinking about how shiny AI is for some people. And I am not teasing my colleagues on this call whatsoever, knowing how enthusiastic they all are. I'm just coming at this from the perspective of, how do you protect your privacy and how do you protect your intellectual property? In the rush to participate, you can find yourself sacrificing things that you didn't mean to sacrifice, whether that's your own original art, your privacy, or something more valuable to you.
The copyright thing isn't just digital creators and people who are creating only on the internet too. Just I think yesterday, maybe, Sarah Silverman came out and is suing OpenAI and Meta for having her likeness on there without her signing it away. Wow. And so this is going to become something that is very clear and present for a lot of creators. And again, not just people who are internet-based creators, who is an entirely separate conversation. I think we tend to devalue as somehow less than other artists or creators. And so it's a little bit annoying that I even have to say, like, people who we think of as like celebrities, but celebrities are concerned about this. And Sarah Silverman, like I said, is suing because of this. And two things. One, think that we need to think about what it means to have our students put information into these things, not just in terms of like what then goes out there, but in terms of their intellectual property, their work. If we're telling them that having their work matters, their thought matters, not something that ChatGPT has created for them, then we need to encourage them to keep hold of their work in a certain way. And what does that look like? And then also, how much can we require students to use services like this, especially when they are not tied as of yet to something like Microsoft Word, which would have like an institutional license, which maybe then you could lock down to, okay, this is just within our university. But right now that doesn't exist. And I know that a lot of us want to create assignments that require the use of these things because we see that this is going to be something ongoing. And we've talked about this before, like as a group of experts right here, we've all talked about this. The idea that you have to be using these tools because this is what's going to be used out into the world and you are disadvantaging your students. And I don't know where that line is between I need you to use this stuff and it's safe to use this stuff. And I'm not sure that we're at that point. And then one other thing that I want to throw out there, and we can sort of come back to it, but before it leaves my brain, excuse me, I keep waiting for and trying to figure out what the moment will be that we come up with some set of rules, laws, something that is the equivalent of what Creative Commons did for sharing and remixing and mimetic images, essentially, and what the projects that Lawrence Lessig and Creative Commons did, especially within the use of Wikipedia as the big thing that pushed that there. I keep wondering what that moment will be where we come up with something like Creative Commons for AI usage. So for example, I am allowing this particular data set to use my likeness to create voice prompt or voice information, but not face information. Or I am allowing the use of my entire person, but you must credit and link to my whatever if you are including me in some generative information that then comes out. Something like that. And obviously, like, I am not an IP lawyer, so I don't know what the actual specifics of that would look like. But I can't imagine that we aren't going to get to some point where we have to, and we're probably closer than we think, where we have to be worrying about what kind of rights we're allowing with our work, with our students' work, with our information. And even if that is checking some box saying I allow an AI to use all of me, or I allow an AI to use none of me, or I allow an AI to this AI, but not that one, some sort of protocol is going to have to happen at some point because we're going to keep running up against this issue until it does.
It's probably going to be like trademark, because that's where you start talking about likenesses and that sort of thing. And I think that some of that foundation is already there. And in theory, Creative Commons could actually continue to cover that. Because really the purpose of CCL is to unbundle the rights so that there's more freedom to do these things. Now, whether or not trademark could be unbundled in the same way is a bit beyond my knowledge here, but I think that could be done. We sort of do terms of service type things now. When we sign up for a website, we can tell them you cannot sell my information on, or you can share my information with a third-party vendor. So I think that the structure itself is there. It's just getting the law to line up with it, and what that may look like. Going back to what you said about where the line is for letting students use it versus not letting students use it, I think what you're going to see and what you've already seen in institutions that have already rewritten their academic integrity policies to accommodate for AI, what you're seeing is freedom. And I mean that in the best way possible. You are seeing the institutions say that it is up to the instructor, or it is up to the department to determine what the appropriate use of AI is in that context. So sort of like the blanket policy is, this is how we conceptualize AI in the context of academic integrity. If your professor says that you can use it, as outlined in their syllabus and their academic integrity policy, then you are allowed to. If you use it outside of how the professor has articulated it, then it would be considered in violation of academic integrity. That's kind of what we're looking at here at NSU, is an umbrella policy that acknowledges that AI and tools like ChatGPT exist, and that some disciplines will have a vested interest in the use of those within coursework, within assignments, and that some disciplines won't. So like the English department is already articulating a policy that for lower level writing classes, AI will not be permitted, but for upper level literary analysis courses, they will potentially allow students to use it as long as it's done according to their policy. And so that's what you're really beginning to see, is to have one blanket policy at the institutional level. Yes, AI can be used. No, it can't be. Is to hamstring everyone. And so it really falls to the individual disciplines and instructors within those disciplines to determine, is this an appropriate tool for my class? Is this an appropriate tool for my discipline? And then what would that look like? So Elizabeth may want to use it in her class with how AI in her communications classes, and that's appropriate for the upper level ones. She may not, if you are having to still teach public speaking, Elizabeth. She might want to say in the public speaking classes, unless I give you an assignment that allows for it, if you use it otherwise, and I determine that you've used it otherwise, that becomes plagiarism, that becomes academic dishonesty, and it will be treated thus.
Frank, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to bring up a specific use case, actually. This came up for us a little different from what's been discussed here. So we just did a big qualitative study involving focus groups and individual interviews. And we have all this data, and usually, at this point, we've transcribed it, and usually at this point, we need to go through and code it. And some of my team have been reading research studies about using AI to do the coding. So we had a conversation about that, and would that make sense? And could we even turn that into a publication, possibly we'll do it manually, we'll do it with AI, we'll see what the results are like both ways, kind of thing. And then we get like another publication out of this data. But the concern I raised was about privacy. So we're taking this transcription and we're sticking it into ChatGPT or some other tool, and now it's in that black box, So I said, I love the idea of using these tools to do something that, as far as I can tell, it probably can do really well, categorizing things, identifying and categorizing, and seeing patterns. So we looked up best practices in this nascent field. And so one of the things that we're going to do it, but we're going to make sure there's no identifying information. That's sort of where we want to make sure that none of this can come back to any individual person. But it definitely was a concern, and it is a concern, and it's something that I want to be aware of as a researcher using these tools. So that's a different application, a different use case, but I think that faculty, as they get exposed to these tools, start to see the advantage of using them, especially in a research environment. I mean, they're really adept at those types of functions. And I'd hate to see people not using them because of the privacy concerns. I think there just need to be policies and procedures in place to ensure that it's safe to share information that way. So that's how it's come up for us. I haven't really encountered it in the classroom as a sort of a classroom concern yet. Usually the conversation there stops at how do I keep it out of the classroom, not how do I use it and maintain privacy. But I think as faculty become more comfortable integrating it with their assignments, that will become a bigger concern, right? Because students are putting their original material into ChatGPT or Bing or Bard or whatever, Tome, or there's countless legions of AI applications out there now, and they're all using the same APIs. So how do you make sure that your IP isn't taken, or that you're not violating some privacy FERPA agreement or whatever? There's so many laws out there that could potentially be tripped. That's really important. So, but
I think the
we
research thing is really, really one to hit on, because that's come up in some research projects that I've been on, particularly around critical discourse analysis. I mean, you have all this text and you could very easily put in the sort of themes, but then it was like, okay, when we don't typically need IRB for critical discourse analysis, if I'm pulling from a text, in our case, it was open access journals. We were going back and coding those journals for themes. So technically it was open, but it was this real quandary as to, but we never disclosed that this information was then going to be inputted into this AI that was going to retain that information, that could chop it up and spit it out in a different way with no attribution or citation as to where. And I think that is a lot of the concern. And I think a lot of people's hesitancy with open AI in general is that they haven't been very transparent about the data sets that have been training the AI. When you ask those questions, they get real sort of like close-fisted about it because they don't want to disclose. And just recently, there was a whole like conversation on Twitter and Threads about Google changed its terms of service to be very vague about, if you utilize their products, what exactly are they able to extract to train all of, not just, they changed it from large language models to AI. So it's now any sort of AI application they could be creating. So then there was this conversation. So if I'm using Google Docs and I have my settings shared to public, could theoretically Google say, because of the vagary of language in the terms and conditions that you have signed on to use this, could they take anything that has a public share setting and essentially make the argument it's open? Anyone with this link can view. It's not locked down. It's not share only. So a lot of people are thinking, oh gosh, I share a lot of things in that way that I don't necessarily want it to go into the training databases. So, and then someone said, well, but also in the same way, people don't really read their social media terms and conditions at what these companies can actually take without ever giving you any sort of credit for, what are the details on that? Like, you're saying it has to be public, but that's not actually what the language and the terms and conditions say. So I think it's an interesting conversation around terms of service. I think more than at the individual level, at the institutional level, people making decisions on the software integrations and the tech integrations that are whole scale being used at institutions like Google and like Office 365, as those terms and conditions adapt. I think somebody should probably, even more so than the institutional policies, be looking at those policies, because those terms and conditions that you have to sign on to have those institutional licenses may be in conflict with FERPA or your own institutional data privacy policies. Like, I think it's easy to start at, what am I going to do in my class to sort of stop cheating? Or what am I going to do in my class to stop students from, if they're working with a third-party organization, accidentally like inputting IP that wasn't supposed to like go, that's a real thing. You think about all the projects that people do, or people who do research have done interviews and all this, and sometimes on very sensitive topics, just throwing their notes into BARD and having it like that. That's never how it was intended. I think that's one thing, but I also think at the institutional level, there should be some serious conversations around what happens when Canvas starts integrating and all of our learning management systems, our SISs, all these other things start integrating AI, and they're selling you, oh, it's so wonderful, it's a time save, which is all true. I hope there is the same type of urgency they want to put on professors about safeguarding data. I hope that administrators have that same urgency as they are being sold the latest and greatest AI innovation that is going to turn their enrollment around and fix the enrollment cliff. Like, I hope that that same energy and pressure that I feel to be the sort of guardian of data privacy for my students, that matriculates up, because I think it upsets the balance if you give us access to all these tools that are extracting data from us left and right and being trained for AI because they're telling you that. But that's fine as long as it increases productivity. It's fine as long as it increases enrollment, but it's not okay if it's in your classroom, because then all of a sudden data matters. So I just hope, again, that these conversations don't get off balance, which I feel sometimes they tilt that way, and it turns into, as I've said before, this whole neoliberal experiment where it's on the person, it's on the individual to sort of deal with all of this. You've got to do it. And if you do it, you have self-empowerment and all these wonderful words, but you're still working in this system that is counteracting any sort of privacy guards that you are doing, because we're scraping IPs out of the LMS. Like, I don't know how you can tell me that I have to be overly concerned when you don't really explain to students how much data they give up every time they click on your website or every time they apply to your institution. Like, if we're going to talk about it, then we should talk about it in all the ways that we are extracting data, and that everyone should be intentional about the data that they share and have agency and make the choices, not just in a classroom where we can throw up sort of these buzzwords of, and they're not buzzwords, but they're real, but thrown up in the same way we use woke, plagiarism. Like, that's a thing that like gets everybody like, woo, woo, woo. But okay, extraction is a thing too. And when there are data breaches and now all of my information is somewhere else, can we have that same kind of energy as when you were wanting to like talk about students cheating? So that's my whole thing. But Frank, you bring up a really good point. And I think for any researcher or just anybody that's sort of wanting to analyze data, I think that's a really important point to make. And I don't know if the research methodologies have caught up with how to do this. I think some disciplines have thought about it more than others, but I think as now people are saying, wait, it's the same way with transcriptions. Do you sort of identify that you used a transcription service versus doing it by hand? Like, that was a thing I remember when we were coding, and that was something you didn't have to do by hand anymore, and you didn't have to put the headphones on and like do the typing. There were real conversations around the sort of like the authenticity of your transcription if you had a machine do it. Same with statistical calculations. We cite that we use SPSS. Like, I did not sit with a calculator and do all of these statistical analyses. I used SPSS. Do we then just, if we figured out the privacy bound, so we de-identify the data, is it just thing that we say codes were themed by AI? And that's enough to know that it's enough attribution to know that I didn't do this all by myself, but also I followed whatever guidelines are in place for best practices to acknowledge data. So I think those are really important conversations. I want to shift a little bit from privacy to, and we've kind of started the conversation, to data. And I think we've had conversations around this, like internally, about who owns data. I think this is a really interesting discussion to have in the era of open, because what is open, right? Like I think, the recent push in the last couple of years, Megan, this is your area, of open education and open pedagogy and all these things. And so we've been having these conversations, and then here comes open AI, right? And I think for those of us who have been in the open space, I think we kind of see like, oh, wait, there's a lot of possibility. But also, just like there were concerns about people creating OERs and using somebody's information, we had to be trained on attribution and no, you can't put this in an OER, and no, that this is not, you can't remix. Like, are we going to be having those conversations around OpenAI, or is everything going to go behind a paywall? I heard someone say the internet essentially is just going to become a paywall garden, that if you are living in this era, this might be the last breath before everything requires a login and a credit card.
Oh.
Like not just a login, but a login and a credit card, and what that does for the exchange of information if we move to that. And I think AI is not the reason we're having it, but it maybe is the impetus. So I'm gonna let y'all talk about those things.
Intellectual freedom intellectual freedom and academic freedom are at the heart of what we do as faculty. And I think that it's one of those things where, and I said I was going to say this again and again, where our values do not have to change if we don't want them to. So academic integrity is still important, just as plagiarism is still unacceptable. Whether you're doing it because you stole your roommate's paper out of his desk, or you had an AI bot, write it for you, at the end of the day, the act there is plagiarism, and we are going to treat those things, at least at NSU, the intention is to treat those things equitably. If you plagiarize, here are what the outcomes are possibly going to be. This is what the punitive penalty is going to be. As far as the paywalls, I think that goes back to our conversations around the digital divide as well. That if you can commodify it, if you can commercialize it, then you can control it. And yes, there are freemium, free versions of these bots out there. I was in a webinar not long ago that actually will show you a variety of AI tools in one setting, and you can filter it by whether it's free or freemium or premium. And it was amazing to see what was still available at the free level. Like, I was genuinely surprised, but yes, you are going to see more and more of that stuff go behind the wall. And I think some of it is going to be because we are obsessed with data, and we are obsessed with tracking data, and we are obsessed with the return on investment. Even amongst open educational resources and open access, there are feelings about whether or not you should require users to log in to use your website. I come from that school of open access thought that says, no, you can read my journal without logging in. And then people will say, well, then how do you track your users? How do you do all of this? And I'm like, that's not the point of my website. The point of my open access journal is to provide open access research in my field. Well, how are you supposed to justify your use? How are you supposed to justify the cost? And it's like, well, I'm not. That's not what the purpose of this site is. But that ability to segment, that ability to track certain parts of the population, that ability to see their behavior across platforms. Our focus on data has really sort of trapped us in a way, because our desire to know, our desire to understand how our resources are or aren't being used, has sort of put us in a place where we feel like we have to be able to scrape that data out. I'm going to use your term scrape there, really and truly, out, so that we can justify what we're doing. We can justify the effort that we're putting into it. And that's weird to me. Because most of us are not really making a buck off our research anyway. So why would we have to show a return on investment? Again, intellectual freedom, academic freedom, the ability to teach what we would like to teach and how we want to teach it within reason, and the ability to explore ideas. The thing is that our values around data, I don't think have to change substantively either. We would have de-identified data anyway before. Now we just have to do it differently and account for it differently, and to become, until that practice itself becomes mainstream. Again, I remember the shift from this is how we calculated our statistics to we used this version of SPSS to use it, to we used SPS to calculate it. We're not even going to bother to tell you what version we use, because it updates so frequently now that there's no point. That ubiquity will occur, and I think it's, again, up to the individual discipline as to how they feel about that ubiquity, and then how it is documented and expressed. But as far as how that data is used, I think that is something that we've already been sort of addressing when you create a data set, especially human-based data set, especially in qualitative data, you are expected in the consent form to say, this is what you're consenting to, and you are consenting to future uses of your information in reasonable ways. I think we just may have to add to that a checkbox that says this data may be used to be a part of generative AI models in the future, so that people have the option to opt out. You talked about empowering the individual, Elizabeth, and I agree that at some level that's where a lot of that's where a lot of that action is happening, because I think our ability to scale up and figure out how an organization can control an AI and how it can use an AI to control its data or to filter it, I think we're still piecing that out. I don't think we have a standard operating procedure for that yet as an organization, whether I'm talking about a university or I'm talking about Netflix or I'm talking about Bank of America or I'm talking about Target. The way that they use data is similar to the way that we use data here when we start thinking about our students as price points. And I hate to say that, but we are staring down an enrollment cliff that does necessitate looking at our students as price points. But then we have also got, again, academic freedom, intellectual freedom, and I think that changes the shape of it. But again, our values can remain the same. It's how much we're willing to sacrifice those values and how we're willing to shape how we express those values that I think is the most important part of this. Does there have to be an ethical dilemma? Not necessarily. Again, if you're de-identifying data anyway, because that's part of your research process, to anonymize the participants and to anonymize their comments, we're already practicing that. We'll have to add an extra layer to account for the AI element that could be used there. But I don't think that has to change our values around the importance of de-identifying or the importance of anonymizing these things. I think we have to remind ourselves that these values can remain constant, in the same way that when electronic health records became the status quo in healthcare, patient confidentiality didn't change. You just had an extra box to check when you did your annual paperwork update that allowed your care provider to share your materials electronically, to do that within that system. And I think we're just going to have to see a lot of that come into play, but how that's going to come into play, I think will vary from industry to industry and vary from discipline and profession to discipline to profession. And I don't think we have to figure that all out for our colleagues. In some ways, they may be better equipped to help us think about that. But I think we can look to a phenomenon like electronic health records and see how that responds to HIPAA and see how that responds to things like FERPA, and take that as a model for how we deal with data in these AI settings. I think there's a lot of answers that we can find, at least structurally and behaviorally, in those practices that could guide us.
I find it, I don't know, so the way that we would think about things that you're talking about, like data privacy and those sorts of things in this context, and immediately when you say data privacy, you start talking about, like, you know, the openness of open AI, I think about what happens if we then do put everything behind paywalls, and sort of the work and perhaps failure of open internet in general, and the rise of things like, not to go back to a certain, I don't know, clearly like aging myself, but like Napster, LimeWire, right? Like when this moment happened, when we wanted information as a culture, and rather than thinking about like individual privacy, which Megan, I think you've talked about extremely well here and thought about so clearly, which does not surprise me, and thinking about it in terms of things like electronic health records and things like that, the way that we conceptualize that, what about culturally what we want? So individually, we want the box to check. Culturally, do we want access to data sets what access do we want or need, and how would we then process those? What does data set piracy look like? And like, at what point does something like, you know, Pirate Bay for generative AI data sets exist? And how does that then inform future work if that's where you're getting the information? And I think we have all been in situations where we're like, look, I can't tell you that the textbook might be available if you Google this way, because don't do that. I would never tell you to do that because that would be bad. I'm just saying, if someone did, I'm sure they would find it and you wouldn't use it, you very clever people who would never do that. I think we've all done that, right? Maybe, I assume. Not me. But like, what does that look like also? If we're like, hey, there's a really interesting data set that would be behind a paywall because we are in a paywall internet now. And I know that you would never look on a data torrent, I mean, I don't even know what that would look like, site and find this for your project. I'm sure that you would be getting this through pay means that like we as a university can't pay for. And I have to ask you as an individual to pay for these data sets. But these data sets exist out there, maybe find them and then use them for your AI. Like, what does that look like culturally when we want that? And at what point would we reach something like, again, using something like movie and TV piracy? I think we all sort of reached this moment where things like Netflix were like, well, what if you pay a low fee for access, for all access? And people went like, yeah, I'll do that. I don't want to possibly be getting viruses from LimeWire every day of my life. I'll pay. And then we sort of, you know, again, shifted to where we're like, well, now we're not paying that much. And it's too fractured. We want a central location. So I'm curious to see if there's like a trajectory of this that maps to something like that, where we're like, okay, we want access to these AIs, to these AI data sets, to these AI products, to this ability to do that. And sort of like that same project of like Linux and like GNU and those sort of things, and having an open version of this, and how that fed into piracy and I don't even want to call it hacking, but like that, yeah, like piracy in that way. I'm so curious as to like where we wind up in that sense.
It will become parts of databases. That is what it's going to happen, is that these data sets will be sold, they will be commercialized, and they will be targeted at the library. And it will become the library's continued job to pay that bottom line for those resources and make them available. There are already databases out there that contain data sets. There are already resources out there that contain that kind of material that libraries are making available. And of course, somebody puts the bill, and it's usually the library. And that becomes an affordable education resource for the students, but that is one possible trajectory of that. You're already seeing institutional repositories at colleges where that's where they're sharing the data sets and they're controlling it. So we can still save these data sets and make them available as long as we continue to control them. And that becomes an IP question, it becomes a copyright question, it becomes a trademark question. But institutions, at least of higher learning, still have a lot more control over what's being produced in their hallowed halls than they want to acknowledge. It's just, how do they share it in an equitable way that benefits not just the institution itself, but its sister institutions? How do they benefit others? And even doing that is expensive, but it can be done. It can be done. It's just, if we want to keep it from becoming a walled garden, we have to really be thoughtful about our practices at the cultural level, Meredith, returning to that. You know, everybody pays for ProQuest. Everybody that does electronic theses and dissertations in higher ed contributes their EDTs to ProQuest. Why? When we could be putting them in institutional repositories that we control, which would give students more control over their own theses and dissertations, because once you drop it in ProQuest, if you don't know anything about copyright, you've signed away your thesis or your dissertation, and now ProQuest owns it. You have to cite yourself if you cite it. It's crazy. But because that's just the way it's always been done, institutions are still using Crocco. But there are other institutions that are saying, you know what, we're going to pay for an institutional repository platform, and we're going to put our material there, and we're going to profile it, and we're going to shine a light on the work of our students and our faculty that's not behind a paywall, that doesn't need to be behind a login, that doesn't have to. There are always going to be circumstances where it has to be. Music students who perform licensed material, they can't put that out there on the web because they probably didn't pay for a public performance license when they paid for that sheet music. But putting that behind a paywall, or putting it behind a login wall, not necessarily a paywall, but a login wall, is doing your copyright due diligence. And I think that is a practice that continue to spread farther, but that does take education, not just of our students, but of our faculty as well, about what copyright looks like, what fair use looks like, what CCL looks like, so that we know what we can and we can't do with what we're producing, again, in the hallowed halls of academia.
So, Megan, thinking about like the ethics of using generative AI, I actually read The Ethicist this weekend. It's probably one of my favorite sections of the New York Times because I'm not nerdy. But one of the questions that was posed to The Ethicist was, I really like the use of generative AI, things like ChatGPT, Bard, when I'm doing my like administrative work, because it just cuts down the amount of time that I spend, brain power I spend trying to think of phrasing along requests or regurgitating, restating information that is already known. And so is this okay? Like, is it okay? And the ethicist's answer, and I'm curious for all of your answers, was that yes, using generative AI to assist in a task that is administrative and that you most likely would have pulled up an old version of the form, the request, what have you, and retooled it or reworked it is perfectly fine in a generative AI tool. However, when it comes to publishable academic work, that's where we have to draw this line that the creative phrasing comes from us. Yes, Megan, you're dying. I can see it.
This is a thing that we teach students in information literacy. Common knowledge does not have to be attributed. You do not have to cite common knowledge. Abraham Lincoln was a president of the United States. That does not require attribution or documentation. So using generative AI in that way, completely in line with the, I want to say an ethicist, and that is not the appropriate term, the ethicist is completely correct. Think of how many templates we all use in a day. Think of how many forms we all use in a day. Why wouldn't we want to use this recyclable material? I mean, that's even a part of open access. That's part of open pedagogy, is creating renewable, reusable resources. So if we're already doing that as a pedagogical practice, I think using ChatGPT in a similar fashion is completely acceptable. Now, when you start using it and you're trying to create something entirely new and creative that you intend to take credit for, that's when it becomes sketchy. That's when it definitely becomes a gray area. And it's the ethicist, it sounds like a librarian to me, because like that's why do we don't need that documentation, we don't need that attribution. If it's common knowledge, if it is common knowledge, it doesn't have to have that. And I think it's totally fine to rely on AI for those kinds of basic tasks. There's nothing wrong with that. But when you start being creative, it starts getting grayer and it starts getting more difficult, because we can't just say, well, people create digital content all the time using this, that, and the other thing. I follow some really talented artists. None of them will rely entirely on anything like Midjourney or DALL-E. Most of them will say, I sketched out the big picture. I sketched out the biggest part of this and then used DALL-E or Midjourney to refine my vision. I'm far more comfortable saying that's a creative process than somebody who just plugs in a prompt into something like DALL-E and gets an image and is like, haha, now I'm an artist.
To me, I think it it goes to this idea of, again, one of the things that keeps coming up for me as I think about AI and talk about AI is this decoupling. And I've talked about this before, of sort of that thinking and doing, and like the way that we show that we have thought about something. And I feel like for so long, the way that we've shown that we have thought about something is by being able to create something, whether that is writing or visual art or a performance piece or whatever it is, words. We create something to show that we've thought about something. But what if the prompting is the creation? What if that's the way that we show something, is that we can prompt it well?